Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. This is our 11th edition of our COVID-19 webinar series. We are glad to bring these updates to NTMA and PMA members on the latest government responses and strategic communications issues related to the pandemic. I am Caitlin Stickles, and I'm a principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. We are the strategic communications firm who works with NTMA and PMA to advocate for you and spread your messages in Washington and beyond. Joining me on today's webinar is Paul Nathanson, a partner at Bracewell, as well as the guys from the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. And they are your talented on-the-ground team in Washington who advocates for NTMA and PMA members truly as the voice of small and medium-sized manufacturing up on the Hill every single day. So like I said, this is the 11th edition of our COVID-19 response webinar series. You can find the information that we share today, both this webinar, its recording, and the PowerPoint slides, as well as a number of other resources that we described during the call on our onevoiceinfo.org website. That URL is at the top of your screen. I also want to flag for you something that we created this week. On last week's webinar, we talked a lot about a survey that we had recently conducted and the results that came in from NTMA and PMA members. We created this infographic with those survey results. Of course, highlights being the big number of members who have received PPP loans and used them to retain employees that they may have otherwise had to furlough or let go. But then on the flip side of that, the many members who may still have to make those difficult decisions when that loan financing runs out. So we use those survey results to identify and advocate on legislative priorities, but also to tell your stories in media. Infographics are one way that we do that. You can find this infographic on the social media accounts for One Voice. On Twitter, that's at One Voice 4, spelled out FOR, MFG. You can also find it on the NTMA and PMA Twitter accounts and other social media platforms. So please do share that infographic and other information that you can find on social media. And with that, I am going to turn it over to John and to Omar, who will take us through the agenda and then get us started on the latest issues of the day going forward.
Thank you, Caitlin. This is John Guzik. I appreciate all of you joining us once again for our webinar. We're going to talk today about some more state and city openings. Certain guidelines have come out in this past week. We're going to update you. The Federal Reserve has issued some additional guidances on the Main Street Lending Program. If you recall, there's the Paycheck Protection Program, there's the EIDL program, NSBA, and the third leg of that tree of money is the Main Street Lending Program from the Federal Reserve, and we're going to talk about what they announced this week. There were interim final rules issued at the SBA regarding the Paycheck Protection Program for guidance and for procedures. We'll talk about that. Yesterday, the House of Representatives passed a tweak to the PPP legislation, which I know many on this phone will find interesting, and then we'll continue to update you on the larger Phase 4 COVID-19 economic stimulus, rebuilding America program that is yet to move forward. Then we'll end up with questions, but feel free on the side of this webinar. There's a question box. Feel free to type in a question. Don't wait till the end. We'll try to address those questions as they come up. So with that, there were two announcements this week. One from the City of Chicago, and I want to point out City of Chicago, one, because we have a lot of members there, but two, we have seen in the past where states will make a reopening announcement, but a city within that state would have a different announcement. We saw that in Colorado. Colorado, made some announcements, yet the city of Denver was much more conservative in their reopening guidelines. So here we have the City of Chicago opening up, clearly calling for face masks. The CDC actually this week said it should be cloth face masks. There's requirement or recommendation for health screening. But the other one is, look at the box on the bottom. It's talking about travel. They are recommending no non-essential travel. The only travel that would be allowed is critical. So as you think about reopening and how your sales force is going to work moving forward, I think that's something that we need to take into consideration, specifically for the folks in Chicagoland. Fast forward to Pennsylvania, there were some, typical guidelines for masks and stuff. And here it lays out a lot of these guidelines. But in the Pennsylvania one, I want to highlight, they recommend that you don't have mass arrivals and departures at the same time. And I thought, that's probably a common sense approach that I hadn't thought about, and maybe you haven't either. But as you move forward and putting together your plan to reopen, that may be something you may want to take into consideration. Also, in the Pennsylvania plan, they ask that businesses have an exposure plan. So if there is an incident in your facility, what is the plan moving forward? And they're encouraging a written plan moving forward in the state of Pennsylvania. So we highlight these just to, as you consider how you're going to open up, and as we've talked about in these past several weeks, hazard assessment of your facilities. These are just additional hints and tips that you may want to consider as you put together your plan moving forward. So, Paul, we've had additional work, additional info that members are able to tap into. So why don't you tell us about the recent webinar?
Yeah, so yesterday, the Bracewell lawyers who handle OSHA issues did a webinar that I know several folks who are probably on this webinar attended. It had really good practical advice regarding dealing with OSHA and what the OSHA guidelines are. So we have put a link up for recording of the webinar on the onevoiceinfo.org website, and I encourage you to take a look at that webinar. I thought it had really good practical information.
Thanks, Paul. Jumping into the Main Street Lending Fund, and so there's been a little bit more developments here. And we mentioned last week that there were some webinars coming up. There was one today at 11 o'clock. We were on actually two of them, one on Mexico and one on funding the Main Street Lending Facility. What the Federal Reserve is intending to do, they're hoping to have this open here in the coming weeks. We pretty much have all of our covenants, our terms, all conditions, all FAQs have now been posted. It's being run by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So if you just go onto their website or even onto the Fed's, you'll be able to see a link to that. So we've got all the information that the lender would need. Everything that a borrower should know has now started to be out there. This is a graphic that they also put out a couple of days ago and had on their webinar this morning, just to kind of give you an idea of how this flows. Again, the point of this one is to really focus that it's going to be run through your lenders, similar to the way the 3P program was. This is not like the EIDL where you go on to a government website and you apply. So we encourage you to get started on this, and we'll talk about how it relates to the 3P program in a second. But our understanding is this could launch most likely the week of June 8th, but possibly as early as late next week, because we know they're talking to lenders last week, or this week rather, and then again on Tuesday, there's another call with the lender community. So on these next two slides, just a couple of quick background on what we've learned from the FAQ that was recently issued this week on the Main Street Lending Facility. The most important being that if you received 3P program funds, so Paycheck Protection Program loan from SBA, you are eligible for also the Main Street Lending Facility. If you took an EIDL grant, you are also eligible borrower under the Main Street if you meet the other eligible criteria. The minimum loan amount, as a reminder on this one, is $500,000. And for most of our members, there's a calculation, I call it's either 10 or 25 million. I think it's 10. And so on that one, this could really help a lot of our members, especially those that are looking at how are you going to be able to purchase some of those materials and the equipment that you need as you attempt to restart. Our concern is that cash flow. The 3P program has focused so much on the paycheck part of it. We now are just trying to work on saving the business and getting restarted. So we are looking forward to that starting, and we do encourage you to start reaching out to your lenders. We got a question that came in. Is there any site that lists participating lenders? Unfortunately, at this time, there is not. The SBA for the 3P program did list the different lenders that were involved in there. However, we do not have a list of that. You just have to reach out to your area lenders to ask if they intend to participate now that we've got some more information. So unfortunately, you do have to reach out to them. But again, it doesn't, if you got your EIDL or your 3P program, that also helps if you can. What program loans are based on? Is this going to be based on LIBOR? And I know those of you that are in the financial market saw that this week was the announcement they're going to phase this thing out at the end of September or September 30th. But yes, it is still being run on LIBOR instead of SOFR for those of you in the finance world, the CFO have asked us this a couple of times. Here's the clarification rather, that they will do it. And then lastly, before I turn it over to John to talk about the 3P program status, is when do we need to pay loans? We got clarification that both principal and interest, they are deferred for 12 months. You'll recall that currently the 3P program is only a 6-month deferral. The Main Street lending facility will go on even further. So we do want to make sure that your members are aware of this. This is another facility we've talked about, low interest loans that could potentially help with restarting some of the economy there. But John, 3P program continues to chug along, but not as much demand as in the past.
Yeah, and whether it's because of the focus of the SBA of getting loans to the smaller lending institutions, minority-owned banks and veteran-owned banks, or that there's so much lack of clarity in the PPP program that it seems to have slowed down. But here's the latest stats. The average loan is $114,000, but to date they've loaned out $510 billion. There's still money left in the account. So if there's those on this call who haven't already participated, we encourage them to do that. But I also want to go back to what Omar was saying about the Main Street lending program, and that's a tremendous opportunity. And I think it's important that everybody start doing their due diligence now, finding that appropriate lender, finding out what the needs are, what the lender is going to need for paperwork from you as you move forward, because I think this is going to be a very popular program, not just with small and medium-sized manufacturers, but even some of the big boys moving forward. So we also got some clarification this week on what is determined for compensation. And so totally for compensation, for calculation for the 3P program, it's wages and salaries, but it also is your retirement contributions and health benefits that you receive. So that is your total package as you put together your what is total compensation specifically for owners and higher level people. Keep in mind, forgiveness is only for those making less than, they will forgive salaries and compensation under $100,000 or the dollar amount of $15,385 for the 8-week period. And so anything over that wages over that would not be compensated, but we did get the clarification that retirement contributions and healthcare benefits would also be included as well. Omar, they gave some additional.
Yeah, for owner employees. So this is an important distinction here that they just came out with. This is new. This is in the interim final rule that was released last Friday, and this is different than what many people had expected going in. So again, it introduces this term called owner employee. Most of our members can imagine what that is. It's somebody who owns it, but is also paid on a certain Schedule C or other areas, and that way they are part of an owner, but also collecting a salary from the business, similar to what John and I do. In the case that an owner employee is earning over $100,000 annually in 2019 compensation, or as John mentioned, the $15,385 for the owner employee, not for all highly compensated employees making over 100K, but only for these folks, that this applies for general partners that are dealing with self-employment. You will have your healthcare and your retirement count towards your $15,385 limit. That does not apply for other highly compensated employees. It is just for those employees that are also an owner of the business in there. And I think we got a question on, does this also apply to C corporations too? Again, on this one, I heard from an accounting firm that our understanding is yes, it does, but we do suggest contact your CPA, especially because many of you have different ways in terms of how you are reporting your self-employment income, and then also how you might have a holding company between you and your direct salary. So that one, I think, is going to be too many case-by-case specifics, but this is important to stand out with your CPA because this is going to be a different calculation that everyone was anticipating from where we were even just a week ago this time Friday. Similarly, you can also take a look at another clarification that came out with regards to bonuses, hazard pay, and furloughed salaries. This is also in the IFR. When we say IFR, we mean interim final rule. That is what came out on May 22nd. The IFR on forgiveness, which is what these slides are, states that you can count in hazard pay and bonuses eligible for loan forgiveness. That's the red line at the bottom. The red line at the top also is helpful because we know many of you have furloughed employees but are still paying maybe a reduced salary or some other kind of help for them. And so this way you can also have this part forgiven. And so we think this is an important and a positive clarification for manufacturers in this, especially when it comes to the hazard pay. Although we've heard a number of attorneys counsel try to come up with a different terminology rather than hazard pay, especially as if COVID continues, the employee may think they're entitled to continue receiving it as such. So we've talked to others about coming up with a more creative name for that. But then lastly, before we turn it over to John, because I know there's some questions on unemployment and people not wanting to return to work, but this was related to last week. We spoke about in the application form how it allowed you to set up an alternative payroll covered period, meaning that if your payroll fell just outside, so let's say you got your loan on April 15th, but your payroll was processed on April 20th, you could start your 8 weeks on April 20th in order to align it with payroll under the alternate method they allowed for in the application. They did the same thing with utilities here. So what they're doing is, let's take their example on the bottom part of the screen with your utilities. The borrower may seek forgiveness for the portion of his July electricity bill through the forgiveness end date. So let's say your covered period ends on July 26th, or excuse me, but in your utility bill gets paid on July 30th. You're allowed to have all the utility forgiven up to July 26th. And then you don't count in your final 4 days of the month, or 5 days rather, of July to count through the 31st. So they are allowing you a different way to align your utilities during that covered period. And here we did get a question that we're getting almost every week. Was there any clarification if cell phones can be used for the 3P loan? So far, most accounting firms that we have seen have said the answer is yes. However, we have not received a clarification on cellular phones counted as utilities, because they've done a couple of things under utilities. They say the word telephone, and then they also have a comma, etc. We don't know what the etc. means, and you'd think it would be helpful to get that guidance, but most CPAs are advising to include your cell phone, at least in the documentation, until you get to the lender forgiveness stage, and then you can work it out with your lender if we don't have further clarification. But John, the unemployment thing is pretty significant, especially as we try to make sure that people come back to work.
Yeah, we are getting questions weekly from you on this particular issue, and you've got employees who know about the 600 additional unemployment benefits, and they want to be, they would rather get that money than work for you. And so we get a lot of questions on this. So we did get some clarification. If you as an employer provides a written proposal to invite your laid off or furloughed employee to come back to the job at the same salary and same hours, if that employee rejects that, that employee is no longer eligible for unemployment insurance. And so I think that's an important clarification moving forward as you have conversations with some of your employees who are, who really want to be let go and do this. If this happens, if you offer them the job, they would not get that job back. But there's further guidance that it says that you as an employer then now have the responsibility to notify the state or local unemployment office to let them know of the change of status of said employee, and you have 30 days to do that. So I think that's important clarification moving on for you and for your employees who may be thinking that, hey, there may be an opportunity out there that I can get additional money. We also received additional guidance on forgiveness of loans, and we're going to talk. We talked a lot about the forgiveness loan program. We talked about last week. We had the application out, and now we're getting additional clarifications. And for loan forgiveness, it's maintaining payroll. And there's two ways that they're looking at loan forgiveness. One is looking at the number of FTEs and looking at wages. And so here's a specific guidance on how you deal with FTEs from a previous period. And in this example, if earlier you had 10 full-time employees, and then today, as of June 30th, and we'll touch on the importance of that date, you only have 8 full-time employees, 20% of your 3P loan would not be forgiven because you reduce your employees based by that number. Omar, they also have an alternative way of how they address wages.
Yeah, so they do a couple of things here. And so when you're looking at the end of your forgiveness period, and we'll talk about the 8 weeks versus extension later on here, you want to keep in mind that there's 2 different criteria that they're going to check. And that's, as John mentioned, you see the red down at the bottom, your FTE head count. That is part of the forgiveness calculation that they want to see. And your FTE head count is a reduction. We call it dollar for dollar, meaning dollar for percent. So if you had 100 employees at the beginning of your covered period, or get your reference period rather, and then at the closing of it that you had only 80, then you'd only have that 80 forgiven. But so that's the dollar for dollar reduction on the FTE side. When it comes to actual compensation, salary, or wages that have been paid, they give you a little bit of leeway. And we've gone through this, but it's been several weeks since we talked about the distinction between the FTE reduction forgiveness and now the 25%. What they allow you to do, not allow you, but they're creating another threshold for you to meet, but they create a buffer for you. So it's not in the aggregate. So when we talked to FTE on the previous slide, they're looking at your overall headcount being reduced, and that's how they take away your reduction on your forgiveness. When it comes to your wages paid, it's by employee. So it is not your aggregate overall salaries that have been reduced by 25% as a forgiven. It is going to be the individual employee can have that salary reduced by up to 25% before it impacts your forgiveness amount. And so again, some of this could change through legislation, but that's important to keep in mind that the 25% reduction in wages applies per employee. The FTE headcount is all across the boards. So we had a couple of questions, so let's just pause here and we get into a couple other areas. And one of them is, do the FTEs need to be the same people as the original group? Our understanding, and this goes back much earlier and before we had many of the guidance, our understanding is as long as they are comparable, meaning they don't have to be the same SSN, the same actual individuals, but as long as they are in the same task and are receiving roughly the same wages and salaries, our understanding was the lenders would accept those individuals as being replacement and coming in there. So that's one thing that we'd heard out there. A couple other things that we just want to touch on. We'll get to more of the questions towards the end here. And then it goes to the question, have until June 30th or earlier to return to full-time equivalent employees. So on your FTEs, there's still some question and there's discrepancy between the law and so far how some of the guidance or the application and the guidance have come out. So there's 3 discrepancies between if you have to maintain your employees up and through June 30th, or you just have to demonstrate at the time that you're sending in your application for forgiveness that you've maintained their employees. So we're still looking towards how some of those issues are going to be reconciled. But here's the safe harbor period that's been reiterated, that it is to June 30th. And we'll talk about that in a few slides when John goes into some of the things that Congress is doing. But the last here, before we go through priorities, is on the timeline for forgiveness, since we know many of you are coming up to that point. The first piece of non-legal CPA advice we can give you: do not file for your application for forgiveness right away. We strongly advise you to wait a little bit longer because we do expect changes that we'll discuss that Congress is going to make that Trump will sign into law that will affect the terms of your forgiveness and the lengthened period that you've got. So do not rush. If your forgiveness covered period ends next week, do not rush to your lender immediately to do so, we would argue. There is no SBA deadline for you to file your application. However, we have heard that lenders do have in their own terms specific dates by which you must provide them your application. So you do definitely need to check with your lender if you're coming on your period there. What happens is the 60 days is what the lender then has to review before they send it over to SBA with their recommendation of whether to approve the forgiveness in whole or in part, or deny with an SBA review. Then SBA has another 90 days to go through it. If forgiveness is denied, the borrower has 30 days to request an SBA review. And then if you are under review, which many of you over $2 million will be, then you'll be notified by your lender within 5 days of that as well that you're under review. So that's kind of the timeline. But I know we talked about a little bit last week, so we don't want to get too much detail. But John, just want to remind people some of our priorities on 3P here as we get into the legislative conversation.
Yeah, and this was based on the survey results that we talked about last week, and we don't want to necessarily go over all of those again, but there was recommendations that that we have sent to policymakers on Capitol Hill, the White House, and the administration regarding adjustments to the 3P program. And then there's another set of recommendations of rebuilding America. And so this is a set of recommendations moving forward. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about what changes have taken place. But we can say expanding to 8 weeks, and in a bipartisan way, policymakers see that 8-week term of the 3P program is not workable. I think you're going to see changes somewhere between extensions between 16 and 20 weeks. Omar, we talked earlier about the June 30 deadline. We think there's bipartisan support to address that June 30 deadline. Whether it's the end of the year or another date, we'll wait and see. continue to allow the deductibility of wages and interest and rent, and is all will be continued. And then we're hearing a lot recently from our members regarding the 75-25, or 75% of your PPP must be used for payroll purposes. And so the policymakers are looking at addressing that, and then enhancement of the employee retention credit. Moving forward to the bigger picture, the next stimulus package moving forward, the rebuilding one, what we heard is the concerns about the lack of available credit moving forward, so that you can buy the necessary materials when those jobs start coming in. And so we're pushing for a permanent extension of bonus depreciation and the establishment of a 10-year government-backed loan program that you'll be able to use for equipment, tools, research and development, facility upgrades and stuff. So this is the whole list. We heard from you, and Congress is looking at addressing how to address the onshoring and reshoring issue moving forward, and then business liability protections. That is something critical that we've heard from you, and it is a widely discussed issue moving forward in Congress. So what happened? Just yesterday, the House passed an amazing 417-1. They passed what I would call the tweaks to the PPP program. So in that legislation that passed the House and is off in the Senate, has a number of things. What happened here? So if you recall 2 or 3 weeks ago, the House passed a $3 trillion, the next economic stimulus package. That bill, as we've mentioned in the past, was dead on arrival. But there were some conservative Democrats who didn't want to vote for it. But Pelosi says, kind of deal with them, says, if you vote for this $3 trillion bill, I will pull out what you are interested in, the 3PP program, the tweaks to that, to get a separate vote. And that's exactly what she did, and that's how it happened. So the current bill extends the 8 weeks to 24 weeks. It reduces a 75-25 ratio to 60-40. It extends the terms of the loan from 2 years to 5 years. We're hoping to get 10, but that's still a victory there. So those are just some of the provisions that were included in that bill. So it moves over to the Senate. Senator Schumer has already announced that he supports the bill and is urging the Senate to take it up. Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who's chairman of the Small Business Committee, says not so fast. And there's certain things that he likes in the House-passed legislation, but he believes he's going to make his own tweaks to the legislation. We anticipate the Senate potentially to take up a revised version of this PPP program as early as next week. But regardless, as these changes are taking place, I think there's going to be some bicameral discussions to make sure that any changes that Rubio makes will be acceptable to a majority of those people in the House, considering that legislation moved forward with such strong bipartisan support.
Yeah, what we're hearing on this it's mostly being run by the small business committees, and we've been talking to their staff on both sides of the aisle in both chambers in the last 10 days or so. I think to John's point, the 75%, I think that probably gets dropped a little bit. Rubio has actually said he does like it at 75%. The Treasury Administration, Trump's folks, do want it at 75, so we're fighting them to get it a little bit lower. And then the union stepped in because Pelosi was on our side, but a couple of days ago, the union said, no, this would disincentivize employers from rehiring, so therefore we don't want you to get rid of the 75. So that's how we ended up at that 60-40. I don't know, my gut tells me on the weeks forgiveness, we probably do end up closer to 16 weeks as a compromise there. There is some concern with regards to the extension to December 31st from June 30th. We had a question in with regards to, once my application for forgiveness has been put in, can I go ahead and start furloughing if I need to, don't have work for them? That is one of the questions that we've got, and we've sent that up to Hill staff to make sure that if they do extend it December 31st, that they don't also require you to keep your employees on until December 31st in order to qualify for forgiveness, because that is a requirement that has been included for the aerospace industry that is in one of the Treasury facilities that was created. They have to stay on to September 30th. That's why you're going to see all those people get dumped off payroll on October 1st. So we're watching that closely. The way this is going to happen is, as we mentioned, the House has passed their bill. The Senate is going to go and likely pass theirs some point next week. Question is when. The House is not in session next week. So the earliest that this can get to Trump's desk is going to be the week of June 8th. So we suspect somewhere around Wednesday or Thursday of that week, we'll see those changes, which is why we said earlier, do not go ahead and start filing your application yet. You can collect your information, work with your lender, but keep in mind that we're almost 100% certain you're going to get those 16 weeks extended. Let's talk about what's not in here. We got a question about whether the deductibility of wages, rent, utility as an expense would be permitted. As you all may recall, 3 Thursdays ago now, I believe it was, the IRS issued a notice stating that under IRC 265, they were not going to permit you all recipients who are seeking forgiveness from to expense those or deduct those wages as expenses, which would have been a big hit, would have cost pass-throughs a considerable amount, pretty much about 20%, would have been the hit for a lot of our pass-through members if this goes through. John and I have reported the House and Senate tax writing committee chairs are both in favor. We are lobbying to remove it, but our understanding it was not intended to be included in this round of this bill in PPP. It's going to be used as part of the larger bill that we're going to talk about here, because there's going to be a number of tax provisions that we expect to be in this phase 4 bill that you see here on the screen. We do understand that discussions should start next week with regards to the negotiations on where to go from here. But as you can see, and I'll turn it over to John again to talk about liability in a second, but one of our big priorities, it always has been and always will be, is on onshoring and reshoring. And we've talked to a few folks about this. We spoke to NAM last week before they released their information a couple of days ago on what their priorities are. We shared with them what we were thinking. We've also spoken with the Alliance for American Manufacturing, AAM, and the Coalition for Prosperous America, among other groups, with regards to reshoring initiatives. And here are a couple of them on which that we're starting to look at, as we mentioned in the past, trying to find maybe temporary tax credits for rehiring and hiring Americans, purchasing equipment, installing machinery. The way that we envision this working is that it would apply to everybody, not just those that are reshoring or relocating to the U.S. And that way it would help push in throughout the entire supply chain. But John, as people get back to work, they are worried about liability protection that Cornyn's working on.
Yeah, and so we've met with Senator Cornyn's staff, and this is a priority to Mitch McConnell. Having said that, though, Speaker Pelosi has put a line in the sand, but we would argue that that's more political posturing. She's being supported by the trial lawyers who don't want this liability protection. But I think moving forward, whether it's in the business community or the healthcare community, there's so many specific examples. We have met with a number of House Democrats specifically raising this issue, and they get it. They understand that liability protection is important. How expansive is it going to be? Is it going to deal with private schools? Is it going to deal with swimming pools? We do think business liability protection will be a core component of it, but how expansive it is yet to be seen. In addition to opposing the liability reform, Speaker Pelosi, her main priority in this new package is going to be funding for state and local governments. And that's something that most Republicans are saying, well, let's wait and see how the states are and where they are at this point and what changes have states made in this specific situation. I was talking to a member of Congress in Michigan, happened to be a Republican, critical of the governor, who says we state and local governments need to be funded in this next package. But he said, he went to the governor and says, well, why are you funding the Liquor Control Commission? You're not giving liquor licenses out during this pandemic. They're not inspecting liquor stores, because liquor stores in Michigan, I think, are closed. But you're keeping all those state employees on board. And so you're asking the federal government for more money, but you're not doing the necessary cuts. This is the bantering that's going back and forth in Washington. As we said last week, we believe serious negotiations are going to start next week and probably wrap up by the end of the month, probably with the July 1st deadline moving forward. But there'll be a great sigh of relief once they come to an agreement on the 3P program, which, as Omar said, will likely be mid-June. And then that's when the real serious negotiations moving forward on the phase 3 program moves forward. So, and then throw in the administration. The president still wants individual checks written to taxpayers and such. And so that's a whole nother angle that we throw on top of it. It's going to be interesting. Hold on for the ride.
Yeah, and so let's pause here if we could before we turn it over to the Bracewell folks. We got a couple of questions on some of the legislative issues here, and we just want to address them quickly. Any updates on the taxability of the loan proceeds that are forgiven? This was clarified in that same IRS notice 3 weeks ago on Thursday. I think it might have been April 28th or so, where they did come out in the first sentence. they said that they were going to nail you on the expensing, but in the end of the paragraph, they did reiterate that it is not taxable income. If your loan is forgiven, the IRS notice of a few weeks ago clarified what Congress has stated. It is not taxable income. So that is a clarification there. One other item with regards to legislation, we'll turn it over to Paul and then answer the rest later. Is there any discussion on Capitol Hill of lowering or eliminating existing trade tariffs on raw materials to assist with manufacturing recovery? Well, Paul, why don't I let you go ahead and answer that one as well, since you run that coalition.
Yes, thanks, Omar. Sorry, the question was on the tariffs, on the exclusions.
Whether or not any efforts to repeal the tariffs might be included in the legislation, or if Congress is looking at tariff repeal to help the economy.
Yeah, there will not be any tariff language in there. In fact, Senator Grassley, the chairman on the Senate Finance Committee, who's been leading an effort at reforming the 232 statute, which is the one that President Trump used to impose the steel and aluminum tariffs. He announced, I think it was just yesterday, that efforts to reform the 232 statute have now been suspended because the Democrats and Republicans can't come to agreement on what should be in that bill. So really, there is not don't expect any tariff relief coming from Congress anytime soon, although there are other pressures building. As we have noted earlier, the president the USTR did do a very limited process to exclude some 301 on medical devices, and I think the pressure will continue to build given the state of the economy. And as long as I have the talking stick, so just a reminder to send us all the good things that you're doing. We have over 20 companies, NTMA and PMA companies, featured on our One Voice info website, where you could also get all this information that we're talking about, recordings of these webinars, the OSHA presentation that I talked about, state and local reopening guidelines, CDC guidelines. So please check it out and keep sending us information about what you're doing, whether it's on PPE or COVID fighting or just what's happening with your plant. It's very important for us to continue to be in the media to support the goals that we have for the next round of CARES 2, and obviously the things that are in the PPP bill that was just passed by the House and being considered by the Senate, so they are hearing us. We will be recording a new podcast, our Talking with One Voice podcast, that we'll have out next week. So please listen to that wherever you get your podcasts. Also, a little self-promotion. I did do a op-ed this week for SNPs that is online, that we've tweeted about, that includes mentions of what all good work that PMA and NTMA are doing and what is needed to help all of you as we move forward. Omar?
Thanks, and we're going to get ready to take some questions. If you want to add any others, we've got about 3 or 4 here that we're going to try to answer to the best we can. But we did want to notify you all that if it's okay with this group, we're going to switch to bi-weekly webinars. As Caitlin mentioned, this is our 11th one done here since March 20th or so, I think, is when we started. So it's been a long run. We appreciate everyone's patience that's going through it. We do hope you have found them helpful. But again, with your permission, we'll probably just start skipping to every other Friday, as many of you are starting to get busier again as well. So our next webinar will be held on Friday, June 12th, again at noon Eastern. You all will be getting a registration notification for that one, and then the one 2 weeks following. So with everyone's permission, we'll switch to that if there aren't any objections. With that, we'll take a couple of questions that we've got in the question box. One of them that came in with regards to Jody's, do severance in an early retirement package or voluntary separation agreement count as payroll in the allowed period? So there is, in the IFR that came out last week, there is a footnote that does state that yes, you can include those folks that have a voluntary separation in that payroll as part of payroll. So there was a footnote that clarified that that does include those folks as part of a cost that is in there. So that is a footnote though, so you do have to go looking for it in the IFR that came out. We thought that was interesting, they buried it down there. Another one, is it necessary to document your efforts to provide safe work environment? In their state, COVID illness is presumed to be a workers' comp claim. Does that documentation even matter? This is definitely going to be one for the labor lawyers, but yeah, we're following this closely. I think Connecticut is doing the same thing on workers' comp on claims. The federal government has not gone down that pathway. There has been some discussion of how that interacts between the feds and the states. When it comes to documentation, we've just been hearing from lawyers that yes, it is best to document how you've complied with OSHA, CDC, state, and county health requirements that are there, just and nothing else, to make sure that you're taken care of until the liability protection laws that hopefully are coming kick in. So we
Omar, that from yesterday's OSHA webinar, that was one of the big takeaways. Document, document, document.
Thank you. That's what we're saying on everything, whether it's the 3P forgiveness or especially on OSHA. Document, take pictures, put up dates of when you put up those signs to make them aware. So I think Paul's exactly right. The lawyers who know what they're talking about and got it right on that one. A couple of other areas in here. Someone would say we have not cut staff, but we have cut overtime, so we are paying less hours. Will this cause us to have less forgiveness percentage? So a couple of things to watch on that. That is very common because many of you had an amazing 2019, very robust. And so it depends on the period, the reference period that you chose, whether you chose the first 2 months of this year or you chose, I think it was February 15th, somewhere around there was a 6-month period starting February of 2019. We understand that that could artificially increase what you might be comparing to now. This isn't from us. Some CPAs have suggested maybe look into some bonuses that you could give to make up for that. But the big thing you want to look at is your 25%. Did I reduce that individual's wages, salary more than 25% or more in comparison between the covered period and the reference period? If you have not reduced by more than 25%, then your lender will probably tell you that you're okay. If you're on the border, then you should talk to your CPA in terms of how you can get around to maybe increasing the compensation as long as you know that's going to be forgiven. Now, that being said, John and I were on a webinar yesterday with a CPA firm that cautions that if you're unsure if you're going to get forgiven or if you're not going to apply for forgiveness, paying additional bonuses out of this 3P money means you're just going to have less money to pay the loan back with. And so you want to keep that in mind, that if you're not confident in that portion being forgiven, that you're going to need to keep count of that cash flow for later on that's there. And one person asked us to clarify with regards to the loan forgiveness not being taxable. Same as we mentioned earlier with regards to the deduction of expenses. Those deduction of expenses, the IRS notice says that that is considered double dipping. Congress is looking to clarify the ability to deduct that was their intent. And I think as John and I have mentioned that we are working to get that done. It's not going to be likely in this PPP bill, but most likely it will be in the next Phase 4 CARES Act that's coming up. So that's something that we'll keep following up with folks on that one as well. What if an employee does not come back to work saying they do not feel safe? How will it affect the unemployment insurance? On that one, we'll say we're not lawyers, but it's been clear that fear of catching COVID-19 is not a qualifying reason to not return to work unless they have a note from their doctor that they are in that high risk category or that they can demonstrate that they are experiencing the symptoms or they are caring for someone else that is under a quarantine or under symptoms. So they must return to work. And that is to John's point with regards to the unemployment insurance. Folks, at this point, it's up to you to be the ones that tell them, that notify them that you have a duty. You are now required by the government to report that they are not coming back to work or that they've taken another job or that they're refusing. So now, as John mentioned, you have 30 days in order to do that as well. So those are a couple of the items there. I know we're running a little bit late. We've got a few more questions that have come in. We'll do our best and try to email and reach out to you all and try to answer those there, as we're trying to be sensitive to everyone's time, as we're now getting up to 12:45 almost. So we do have a list of these questions. We will be in touch with some of you on a few of these others. If not, you have our contact information here. Please feel free to reach out to us, to PMA, to NTMA at any time. We appreciate you joining us the last 10 weeks in a row every Friday, and we look forward to talking to you 2 weeks from today. Thank you, everybody.